Out of every 100 people forced onto slave ships in Africa, only 88 survived the journey. 12 died before even reaching the Americas. These are not just numbers, they represent real people, with families and dreams. The transatlantic slave trade was one of the largest forced migrations in history. Over 4 centuries from the 15th to the 19th, ships crossed the Atlantic again and again, not with goods but with people. Historians estimate about 12.5 million Africans were captured and shipped away. Each number was a person, a mother, a father, a child, a leader, an artist. The trade tore apart families, cultures, and entire societies, leaving wounds that still echo today. The journey, called the Middle Passage, was a nightmare. Of the 12.5 million forced onto ships, only about 10.7 million survived the Atlantic crossing. Nearly 2 million died at sea from disease, starvation, or brutality. Their bodies were thrown into the ocean, their stories lost. This is the human cost of the slave trade, a story of immense suffering. But it is a story we must remember so we never forget the true price paid. These numbers are a call to see the faces behind the statistics. The scale of this tragedy shaped the world we live in today. Understanding this history is essential to understanding ourselves. The transatlantic slave trade was not just a chapter in history, it was a catastrophe for millions. We begin here with the numbers we cannot forget. Let's look deeper into how and why this tragedy began. The transatlantic slave trade began with a quest for wealth and power. In the 15th century, European nations like Portugal and Spain sought new trade routes and riches. As they explored Africa's coast, they saw people as valuable commodities. The demand for labor exploded with the colonization of the Americas. Vast plantations needed workers for crops like sugar, tobacco, and cotton. Native populations were decimated by disease and violence, so colonists turned to Africa for forced labor. European traders bought or captured Africans, shipping them to the Americas for profit. This system built immense wealth for Europe and the colonies, at the cost of millions of African lives. Racist ideas were invented to justify this cruelty, claiming Africans were inferior. These lies allowed people to treat others as property, fueling centuries of suffering. The slave trade was driven by greed, enforced by violence, and justified by racism. Its shadow still shapes our world today. Understanding its origins reveals the roots of inequality and injustice. This is how the tragedy began. The journey into slavery began in the villages and kingdoms of West and Central Africa. People from places like Ghana, Nigeria, Angola, and the Congo were captured. Farmers, artists, families, all torn from their lives. Sometimes European raiders attacked villages, but more often African traders and rulers seeking profit or power captured people to sell. Wars were started just to create captives for the trade. After capture, people were chained together and forced to march hundreds of miles to the coast, suffering hunger, exhaustion, and violence. Many died before ever seeing a ship. Survivors were imprisoned in coastal forts like Elmina Castle or Goree Island, waiting in dark, crowded dungeons for months. Families were separated, identities stripped away, and bodies branded as property. This was the first step in a process designed to break the spirit and erase the past. The trauma began long before the ocean crossing. The journey to the coast was a nightmare in itself, and the worst was yet to come. The transatlantic slave trade was part of a brutal system called the Triangle of Trade. Ships left Europe loaded with goods, guns, alcohol, textiles, traded in Africa for people. These goods fueled conflict, creating more captives. The Middle Passage carried enslaved Africans to the Americas in horrific conditions. Survivors were sold at auction, torn from families, and forced to work on plantations. The ships then returned to Europe with sugar, cotton, and tobacco, products of slave labor. Profits from these goods financed more voyages, repeating the cycle. Every stage of this triangle was built on suffering and exploitation. The system was ruthlessly efficient, designed for maximum profit. It connected continents, but at a terrible human cost. The Triangle of Trade shaped economies and destroyed millions of lives. This was the machinery of the slave trade. The Middle Passage was a journey through hell. Enslaved Africans were packed below deck, chained together in darkness, barely able to move. Some ships used tight pack, cramming in as many people as possible, while others used loose pack, hoping more would survive. Disease spread rapidly: dysentery, smallpox, scurvy, killing thousands. The air was foul, the stench overwhelming, and the dead often lay chained to the living. Food and water were scarce and barely edible. The psychological terror was as great as the physical suffering. No one knew where they were going or what awaited them. The sounds of pain, fear, and despair filled the ship. Crew members used violence to maintain control, whipping, beating, and punishing any resistance. Some captives chose death over slavery, jumping overboard into the sea. The Middle Passage lasted weeks or months, a relentless ordeal. Nearly 2 million died on this journey alone. For those who survived, the nightmare was far from over. The Middle Passage remains one of history's greatest atrocities. It was a voyage of unspeakable horror. Survival on a slave ship was a daily battle. Each morning, captives were forced onto the deck for exercise, a cruel ritual meant to keep them alive for sale. Armed guards watched as they were made to dance, whipped if they refused. Meals were meager and unfamiliar. Many, overcome by grief, refused to eat and were force-fed. Despite the terror, enslaved people resisted in every way they could. Some starved themselves, others whispered stories or sang songs to keep hope alive. Bonds formed in the darkness, offering comfort and solidarity. There were over 500 recorded uprisings on slave ships, desperate attempts to break free. Most revolts failed, but each was an act of courage. Some chose to leap into the ocean, preferring death to bondage. Every act of resistance was a fight to reclaim humanity. The will to survive, to resist, and to hope endured even in the darkest conditions. The struggle for survival was constant, and every day was a victory against despair. The human spirit refused to be broken. Arrival in the Americas marked the start of a new ordeal. Captives were cleaned, oiled, and disguised to look healthy for auction. On the auction block they were inspected, prodded, and sold like livestock. Families were torn apart forever. Mothers, children, siblings separated with no hope of reunion. Once sold, enslaved people faced endless labor on plantations, stripped of their names and identities. They worked from sunrise to sunset, under threat of violence and with no rights or protection. Overseers enforced discipline with whips and brutality. The law offered no refuge. Children born into slavery became property too. Life was a daily struggle for survival under a system designed to crush the body and spirit. This was the reality of bondage in the New World. Even in bondage, the human spirit endured. Enslaved people resisted in countless ways, working slowly, breaking tools, or feigning illness. They preserved their cultures through stories, songs, and traditions, passing hope to the next generation. Music and dance became acts of defiance, blending African roots with new realities. Many risked everything to escape, forming maroon communities or following the Underground Railroad to freedom. Heroes like Harriet Tubman led others to safety, defying the system. Violent rebellions like Nat Turner's in Virginia and the Haitian Revolution led by Toussaint Louverture shook the foundations of slavery. These acts of resistance, large and small, proved that the desire for freedom could not be extinguished. The story of slavery is also a story of resilience and courage. The fight for dignity and justice continued, even in the darkest times. The legacy of resistance lives on in music, culture, and the ongoing struggle for equality. The enslaved refused to be defined by their chains. Their spirit was unbreakable. The fight to end the transatlantic slave trade was long and hard. Abolitionists, both enslaved and free, wrote, spoke, and organized to change minds and laws. Figures like Olaudah Equiano gave a human face to the horrors of slavery. Britain banned the slave trade in 1807, the US in 1808, but slavery itself continued for decades. The struggle ended only after wars and revolutions, like the US Civil War and Haiti's independence. Even after abolition, the legacy of slavery endured: racism, inequality, and economic divides that persist today. The echoes of this history shape our world. Remembering the transatlantic slave trade honors those who suffered, and those who fought for freedom. Their resilience and culture survive in the face of injustice. Understanding this past is essential for building a more just future. The story is painful, but it must be told. Thank you for joining us on this journey. To learn more about the stories that shape our world, subscribe and keep exploring.